Hi, Helen Barnard from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Thanks very much for that. I was just wondering, has it been decided yet how eligibility for Pupil Premium will work under universal credit? And if there's going to be the opportunity to expand it out to some of those kids in low-income working families who traditionally haven't been included?
The honest answer is no, and I'd be very interested in ideas on that. It's not a conversation that I've had with Ian Duncan-Smith. I mean, I think at the moment we're thinking we would carry on the way that we have, but I think if there are better ways, and that's one of the exciting things I think about today's summit, about the reports that we've seen, if there are ways of making sure that we are absolutely targeting the right people. I think, David, you mentioned in your opening remarks about the pupils who are just above some of the limits or the free school meals, and I think you also highlight and the NAO does about the pupils, because of the changes, for example, to universal infant free school meals, making sure again that the right pupils are also in receipt of Pupil Premium. So very interested to hear ideas. Can't make any promises, but I will always listen.
I'm Rebecca Allen from Education Data Lab. You talk about introducing a broad and balanced curriculum for all children to study at Key Stage 4. I wonder whether you can give some comments about how schools might go about recruiting the additional 2,500 language teachers that they'll need, and teachers in many other EBAC subjects.
Well, look, we will carry on working. I mean, actually, we know that as the economy is recovering, there's no doubt there are other opportunities for graduates out there. And I think we have to pursue a number of different avenues. And I see both Russell and Brian sitting in the front row, and I know that both of them have had conversations about this already. They will have lots of ideas. I think we need to obviously target those who are currently studying, those who are at university, those who are doing postgraduates. We obviously have bursary schemes. I think financial incentives are right, but that's not the whole answer. We need to look at those who are currently at school, actually, and make them think about going into teaching. And I do think the best recruiting sergeants for teaching are the people who stand at the front of the classroom every day, and those who are heads and inspiring the next generation. I'm keen to look at how we recruit. I mean, we obviously will recruit particularly languages, people from overseas, but also how we look at people coming into teaching after perhaps a lifetime of doing something else or returning to the profession. I was heartened that I won't name him, but a senior partner of a law firm emailed me last week to say, I'm retiring and I've decided to go into teaching. I think he'll be very good, but I'm not going to pass judgment on his classroom abilities until he's been through all the training. But I think that's also very exciting. Now, obviously the EBAC, it's those who start secondary school in September. They'll be starting their GCSE courses in September 2018. So we do have some time. But you're absolutely right. This is one of the key priorities for the department. And thank you also for the evidence I know you gave to the Bill Committee yesterday.
Hi, it's Hilary Levers from the Wellcome Trust here. I actually had the same question, but with the emphasis on science and maths, but I'm happy to ask a different question, which is about bias, actually, and I don't see a great deal of discussion about the inherent biases that we know people suffer from in all walks of life, and how they might be part of the response to this. We know about it, particularly looking at gender, as well as social background in the sciences and maths, but I just wonder if there's a strand of thinking that could be developed in that area.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really good question. I talked in my speech about why I think that all students should have the ability to take or should be taking the EBAC subjects, and that's because otherwise people are being counted out of certain options in the future before they've even started if those options aren't available to them. I think one of the disheartening things is when you go to a university and somebody says, I'd like to have done X, but actually nobody ever told me that I needed to study subject Y when I was at school, and that option has now gone, or unless I were to carry on studying, which, perhaps for whatever reason is no longer viable. So I think there's that. I think making sure that every child, as I say, has an excellent education, excellent grounding. But I think you mentioned gender, but I think, there are two things, aren't there? One is obviously how can we get more girls in particular, but into studying the sciences, but also into then careers like engineers. Now, you will know that before Christmas, I announced the government was backing the creation of an independent careers and enterprise company. Christine Hodgson's been doing some fantastic work about that, and I hope to make a further announcement in the course of today about that company. And I think going in, working with employers, inspiring young people, starting early, showing them what the options are, I don't think all teachers have to be careers advisors, but I think schools have to be open to bringing people in and to expanding young people's horizons. And so that's obviously the issue in terms of getting girls interested. And then, as I say, really good careers advice and explaining to young people what their options are at an early stage. But it goes right back to getting the absolute basics right in primary and then having a broad curriculum, making sure that all the core subjects are open to all pupils, regardless of their background.
Nicky, you've got to just bring us back a little bit to the Pupil Premium more narrowly. Do you think a proportion of the Pupil Premium could be used to reward effective schools more systematically, building on the Pupil Premium awards? And what about schools that don't do that? Is there any chance that they should actually lose to tighten the whole process, if you like? Is there any thoughts on that?
I haven't had any thoughts on that. I'm very open to, as I said, open to suggestions. It's difficult, isn't it, to penalise those for whom whatever. I think I've said before in other forums, I'm more of a carrot rather than a stick type person. I think what I would like to see, and I thought was really interesting in the report, was the way that the increasing number of schools using research as to what works in terms of Pupil Premium. I think one of the challenges for us as an education sector is how do we get great research, great practice out to all schools in the country. When people are very busy running schools, they're very busy being teachers, it's not necessarily that they don't want to adopt this practice, but they've got lots of other things to focus on as well. And so I think if there are examples of things, and I think you've highlighted some in the report, and I think the EF will continue with that work, that really works well. It's about getting that out. And I think Ofsted obviously will inspect on how disadvantaged pupils are doing in terms of schools. I remember a school I went to in West Yorkshire, really interesting that, and I'm sure you'll all have examples as well, of how they were tracking, secondary school, tracking their Pupil Premium pupils. They had a big board, they had all the pupils there, they were absolutely watching the results, what they were doing, were they on course and everything else. And I think it's probably realising, as I said in my speech, it's not just a question of giving the money and then hoping for the best. It is actually, you've got to be much more proactive than that. And that's where I think organisations like Sutton Trust, EF and others can be so helpful, rather than just the DFE saying, yet again, do this. Other people saying this is what works is really powerful.
Hi, Judy Sebber, University of Oxford. We greatly appreciate your comments about use of research in schools, but we still don't have the expectation on teachers to use research as part of their standards, and neither do social workers, which affects this population in particular. I just wondered if you had any plans to look at that.
I think it's very interesting, and I think you're right. There are certain other professions, like obviously medicine, for example, where people do look at research all the time and keep up to date with the latest, or at least they should. Whether there is some form of expectation. One of the issues actually I didn't mention in the teacher recruitment, but obviously one of the issues I discussed with Russell and Brian and others is workload. And I realise people are very busy at the front line, and so actually the question is how do we get the research in a form? People aren't, best in the world, going to spend days ploughing through research papers, but how do we get it in chunks and bite-sized ways that people will look at that and think that's something that could work. And there are schools, of course, who have particular Pupil Premium coordinators or teachers who are responsible for that, and maybe that's their role, and many will already do this in looking at the best, what works. We've also talked about the creation of the College of Teaching, and teaching is one of the last professions, I think, doesn't have its own college. And again, I think that's something potentially that a college should do. So I think if there are ways, again, I'm sort of slightly reluctant for the DFE to say to teachers, I'm going to add this as another thing, I want you to read all these research papers, but where we can do it and working with teaching organisations, I would be very interested to hear more about.
Hi, I'm Kate Wareham from the National Orchestra for All. Can you tell me a little bit about the role you see for arts in narrowing the gap?
Well, I think the arts are hugely important. I am an arts student, and I loved all of my arts subjects. And funny enough, I was talking about this the other day about things like drama, actually, in terms of the building of confidence. Speaking, oracy is, I think, hugely important. And just because we have set out there are some core subjects does not mean that there is not room on the curriculum for other subjects. And also, I think a lot of this comes from leadership, doesn't it? So I was at King Solomon Academy in London a couple of weeks ago. They teach the core subjects, but also every year 7, for example, plays in their orchestra. And whether they're good or not, I mean, I think there were some good, talented violin players, and there were some, I'm sorry if there's anyone from King Solomon here, but there were some who were slightly, but they were all great. They all loved it, they were enthusiastic, and I think it's a huge amount. I think also, actually access to the arts. I think there is nothing like I mentioned, the trips, going to places, seeing things, having your horizons broadened. I think the arts are hugely important, and I'm hoping to say more about that before we get to recess.
David Crossley at Whole Education. I wondered where you stand on the balance of the choice of use of pupil premium funding being at the school level. I mean, a feature of it has been the schools have made the choice of how they've deployed it, and you can argue it's unleashed creativity, and in your words, you want innovation to be the norm, not the exception. As we see evidence of what's really effective, there can be a temptation to prescribe how it's used from the centre. Where do you sit on that balance?
Well, I will be reluctant to prescribe. I do think the sharing of good practice, though, across the system, and it's difficult when you've got 24,000 schools and all sorts of different schools and backgrounds, everything else, to get that best practice out. But I do think that the sharing of that, what is working. I think one of the exciting features of our education landscape at the moment is the collaboration that we now see. People like the national leaders of education going in to support other schools, being able to explain this is what works here, maybe this would work, how can we enable those lessons to be learnt. I mean, you're right, it's interesting about, I do think it's right that it is at the school level. I think it's important, I think it's about recognise the role of leadership and heads. It's interesting because the premium that is paid for those who have left local authority care, of course, does go to the local authority, the virtual school head, and I think that's quite interesting to see perhaps a comparison about how that actually works and what is most effective. But I would be reluctant to move to a prescription level.
Thank you. I'm Anna Darling from Future First. You mentioned when you were speaking that you want every school to follow the progress of their disadvantaged students once they leave school. And I wonder what role you think that former students and alumni of schools can play in informing students about their options in school and also in inspiring them to work harder to achieve higher education.
Oh, I think hugely important. I think there is nothing more powerful than young people seeing somebody who they either remember at school or who was just like them, going back and saying, look, I've been there, I've been in your shoes, and look, this is where you can end up. And I saw the most extreme example of that recently, of course, when the First Lady, Michelle Obama, visited Marlbury School for Girls. And although she hadn't been at Marlbury School, she was able to say to the girls, look, I've been in your position, I know what it's like, and whilst maybe you're not all going to end up as First Lady of the US, I want you to aim high and to absolutely achieve all of your potential. And I remember going to visit Crossrail and talking to one of the apprentices there, and he had gone back to his school. He hadn't actually known really about the apprenticeship route when he was at school. He'd kind of fallen into it by accident, but it was completely the right thing for him. He was a total advocate for the scheme, and he was going back to his school and to others and talking about the opportunities. And I think it's hugely important. I hope that schools, many of them do, keep in contact with former pupils. But I'm also interested in terms of just things like destination data. I think it's really good for schools to know where do their pupils end up.
Becca Dean from the Girls Network, and my question is around post-16. Will Pupil Premium extend to their service, or is there something different that you would suggest?
Well, I think we there is some funding available for the most disadvantaged in post-16. I mean, there's obviously a squeeze on funding, but I think if we were to, there was pitches to be made on particular schemes, but I think we have really targeted it at the earliest years in primary, because and obviously we talked about the differential. I think you mentioned that, David, and perhaps that is something that research can help with. But I do think actually getting it right in at the beginning in terms of getting those absolute basics locked down, the reading, the writing, the maths, is absolutely critical.
Hi, Stephen Gower, Durham University. It's more of a comment, really, because because free school meal obviously eligibility is a threshold. It seems an appropriate vehicle for delivery of the pupil premium, but I have concerns about its use for monitoring and for its use in awards, because there's quite a big difference between the kind of children who are in free school meals and those who aren't. And those kinds of schools are beyond the control of the school, or should be beyond the control of the school. So the gap is often not anything to do with the pedagogy, with the way in which the pupil premium is deployed in the school. And therefore we might be getting a misleading impression about what's going on.
Well, I think that's probably part of part of the research, and obviously that's why the reports we've seen yesterday and today are so helpful. And of course, as I said at the beginning, and one of the issues, the things about the universal infant free school meals has been obviously I know there are some schools who actually now have found it more difficult to make sure that they are getting the right pupil premium for the right pupils, because that's not that threshold has certainly up to Key Stage 1 has obviously gone away. So it's an interesting point, and I think perhaps Kevin's sitting here, and whether that's something that the EF might want to look at to make sure. I mean, I think you're going to discuss it today. I mentioned in my remarks. It's all about targeting the right pupils and doing it in the most effective way. We're absolutely committed to the pupil premium. We want it to make an absolute difference.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for speaking to us and taking the time to share your thoughts both on the broader education priorities that you have and on the pupil premium. And I'm delighted to hear the 2.5 billion is secure. And we greatly appreciate you finding the time in your schedule to come and talk to us this morning. Thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.